Hello again, and welcome to part 5 of Music Theory for Electronic Musicians. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about seventh chords. So, what a seventh chord is, well, you remember triads. We've looked at triads in several different ways. Triads are chords that have 3 notes. A seventh chord is not a chord that has 7 notes. That would be weird. It's a chord that has a 4th note. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little look at the different kinds of chords that are created when you add the 7th, and most importantly, why it's called the 7th. So let's bop on over to Ableton and the piano roll editor and have a look. Okay, so we're getting pretty familiar with our triads here. So I'm going to make us a C major triad. And when I do that, I use the first note of the chord or the root, I use the 3rd, and I use the 5th. In other words, I skip a note. So let's do this. Let's stretch those out like we've done before. And now let's fill in the other notes of the scale. So now we have all the notes of C major. Oops. Okay. All the notes of C major. And we use the 1st, 3rd, and 5th to make our first triad in C major, or our 1 chord, if you will. Another way to look at that is that we use every other note of the scale, right? Have a note, the root, skip 1, another note, skip 1, another note of the chord. Now, what if we kept going, skip 1, and we added another note? This would be a 7th chord. Why is it called a 7th? It's called a 7th chord because we are using the 7th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So these chords, unlike triads, these have another extra note. And that extra note is the 7th. So 7th chords kind of change the quality of the chord. They're still major or minor because the 3rd is what dictates whether or not we're a major or a minor chord. So we're not changing the major or minor quality. We're more adding to it. So the 7th makes it either like really major or really minor, kind of. But to complicate that a little bit, the 7th itself could be major or minor. In this case, the 7th is major. And we can tell that it's major because, well, one way would be its distance from the 5th here. So the same way that we counted half steps down here between the root and the 3rd, we could count half steps up here and say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which would be a major 3rd. So a major 3rd away from the G is a major 7th. An easier way to tell if you're in a major 7th or a minor 7th is to look at its distance to the octave, starting over. If it's a major 7th, it's going to be a half step away, right? So here is our root note, but an octave higher, right? And we're really close to it. We're as close as you can possibly be to it, and that means it's a major 7th. The major 7th chord has this kind of lush beautifulness to it. I don't know how else to explain it. It's a really beautiful sound, actually. Probably the most famous major 7th chord is in the song Under the Bridge by Red Hot Chili Peppers. Let me see if I can cue that up really quick. Okay, here 7th chords have basically 3 different flavors. There's more than just major and minor. There's a 3rd thing. It's kind of major and minor. But what we have is a major chord with a major 7th. That's one thing we can have. So when we get the major chord with the major 7th, we call that a major 7 chord. So that's sometimes written as MAJ7. Sometimes, particularly in jazz, you see it marked as a triangle. That's kind of falling out of fashion, I think. You don't see that very often anymore. But MAJ7 is a good way to do it. So this would be a 1 major 7th chord. So that's one flavor that we can have of it. Another flavor would be a minor seventh chord. So if we take any minor chord, we know that in the key of C, the 2 chord is going to be minor, right? We know that from the diatonic chord progression. Skip 1. There's our 2 chord, our minor 2 chord. If we add a 7th, there's our 7th. So we have a minor triad because this is a minor interval. There's only 4 half steps here. And we have a minor 7th. Another way to tell, if we count from the top, to get from our 7th up to the octave higher of the root, that's going to be this note here, right? So that's 2 steps away. That means it's a minor 7th. Remember, this one is only 1 step away. This is 2 steps away. And remember, we're talking about the root of the chord, so that's a D. So if I flip that up an octave, we see that it's 2 away. This one, the root of the chord is C, so it's only a half step away. So here we have a minor triad with a minor 7th. And this sound is, it's a little bit jazzy. We don't use it a lot, but it's a cool sound. I tend to like the sound of it. I can't think of a really famous one, so I'm just going to see if I can play it by itself. That's the sound of it. Neat. Experiment with it. See what you think of it. It's got kind of a nice sound. So that's flavor 2 of the 7th chord. We have a minor 7th chord, and we would write that as a lowercase m7, like that. So this would be 2 minor 7, sort of. We might not write it exactly this way. We might just write 2-7 because the minor is implied by the lowercase 2, but we don't really care about nomenclature. Lowercase m7, minor 7. And you might be thinking, what on earth could be the third one? The third one is a combination. It would be a major triad with a minor 7th. This could happen, right? And in fact, diatonically, on our diatonic chord progression, it does happen in one place. If we start on the 5th note, so I'm going to build a 5 chord. So I'm going to start it on G. In the key of C, this is our 5 chord. So I'm going to build my triad first. So here's my triad, and it's major. We can see because of that 3rd. Now if I add my 7th, so this is D, I'm going to skip that note and add that note. So I'm going to get rid of that one. So this is my 7th of G. It's a minor 7th, we can tell because it's a whole step away from the root an octave higher. Here, this is where the root would be. It's also 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps only, so it's a minor 7th, but it's a major chord. So what do we call this? If we call this a major 7, we call this a minor 7. This one is kind of half and half, right? It's a major chord with a minor 7. What we call that is a dominant 7, or sometimes just a dominant chord. Shorthand way to do it if we're using Roman numerals is call it a 5-7. That's implied because this really only happens on the 5th of our key, the 5-7 chord. Now the dominant 7 chord has some special powers, just like our 3rd. In particular, the dominant 7th chord has the ability to always lead back home. This is like playing the dominant 7th chord is like a big, huge road sign saying you are heading home now. When you play this chord, it feels like the next thing that should happen is this. Let me play some examples of that for you. Okay, check this out. So what I have here is our 5/7 chord actually. So this is a G7 chord. And here I have just a normal old 1 chord, not a 7th. I took the 7th off just to make this really hit home. So this is the 7th chord. And what's going to feel like when we play this sound, this chord, it's going to feel like this needs to go somewhere. And the place it feels like it needs to go is here to the 1 chord. It has this pull to it. So whenever we want something to sound like the end, a good way to do it is to play 5/7 and then 1, and it'll feel like the end. You know, all those like, well, maybe you don't, but there's like a million symphonies that end by going bum, 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 bum. That's all just going 5/7 1, 5/7 1, 5/7 1. So here's what that sounds like. You hear how this chord felt like it had to go somewhere? If I just play it and stop, right, you want something to happen. What you want to happen is this chord. You're waiting for that. There's a really famous story that Mozart's dad would wake him up in the morning by doing exactly this. By going and then stopping and waiting. And Mozart would jump out of bed and run downstairs and play that chord to resolve it. Because he just couldn't live with that sound not resolving to the 1 chord. It just kind of has to. So one thing we could do is, to make this sound even better, is use what we know about inversions, right? Because each of these notes has its own kind of direction, and that's what makes it feel like that. So I'm going to flip this C chord up an octave. Oops. And I'm going to flip this E chord up an octave. Now it's going to sound even better because it's going to sound like this note wants to go here, and this note wants to go here, and this note just wants to stay where it is. Actually, it'll sound even better if I if I duplicate this C and put it down in the bottom again. So now I have an extra C so that it feels even more super special. Let's hear that. Right? That means, hello, this is the end. So that is a dominant 7th chord. So just to review, so we have 3 different flavors of 7th chords. We have the major 7th chord, which is a major triad plus a major 7. And that 7 is the 7th note above the root of the chord. We have a minor 7th, which is a minor chord plus a minor 7th on it, and that 7th note is 7 above the root of the chord. And then we have a dominant 7, which is a major chord plus a minor 7th. And that occurs on the 5. And 5 always wants to go to 1. 5 wants to go to 1 no matter what we do, but especially when we put a 7th on it, it really feels like it wants to go to 1 more than anything else in the world. So I'm going to draw a lot of arrows pointing to 1, because when we play this, we want to hear that. If you don't play a 1 after a 5-7 chord, you are a jerk. Or, a free thinker, and that's cool too. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, what does this business of 7th chords do to our diatonic chord progression? And that's a good question. So I'm going to rip it out really quick. So pardon me while I write our diatonic chord progression out one more time. Okay, so here it is, our diatonic chord progression. I'm going to slow this way, way, way down. Here's what it sounds like. It'll be familiar. Okay, so we can add a 7th to this whole bloody thing, right? So here's our 1st, 3rd, and 5th, and our 7th. Here's our 1st, 3rd, and 5th, and our 7th. Basically, I can just make a whole nother scale going up from here, and it'll work. So there's all the 7ths in the key of C major as they fit into all of these chords. So the way I did that without thinking very hard was I just started on the 7th of the first one, so C major, making the 7th. I know it's a B. Then I just wrote the scale going up starting on B. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B. That's how it'll line up. All of these will do that. So now we have our diatonic chord progression with 7ths in it. And what that's going to make is, let's have a look here. It's going to be similar. So if you remember, without a 7th, our pattern was major, minor, minor, major, major, I'll jump down here, minor, diminished, and then this is the 1 chord again, so it's major. I'll put it in parentheses because that's 1, just add an octave. Starts with C, C down here. With the 7th, this makes a major 7, a minor 7, a minor 7. This one is a major 7. So they're correlating really directly, right? Major chord becomes major 7th, minor chord becomes minor 7th, major 7th here. This one is our weird dominant 7 because that's the 5 chord, right? That one is the weirdo in the situation here. This one becomes a minor 7th, our 6th chord. Our crazy diminished chord from before is kind of the opposite of a dominant 7. This is a minor 3rd here and a major 3rd there. It's upside down of our minor chord. And what we call that is a half diminished, or we could just keep calling it a diminished. So it's just kind of super diminished to us. A half diminished is kind of a more technical term. We don't use it very often. Let's just still call it a diminished. And then a major 7th again as our root. So adding a 7th to our diatonic chord progression creates really the same pattern, major 7, minor 7, minor 7, major 7, with the exception of the 5 chord becomes a dominant 5 chord, that weird major chord with a minor 7th. So we have a minor 7th here and a major 3rd here. So it's a major chord with a minor 7th. Let's hear what our diatonic chord progression sounds like with 7ths built in. You can almost feel that it's got a little bit of jazz to it because we're adding these thicker chords. Remember, I always said earlier in an earlier lesson that once we get beyond triads and we start adding more extensions to chord, extension means like a seventh, and there's more that we could add, it starts to get a little jazzy. But these are useful to us if we want to add a little more color to the chords. So that's seventh chords. You can experiment with adding them into your stuff. They're cool. They have a lot of fun uses. They're, if nothing else, they're a way to liven up what you've got. If you're getting sick of the triads, try throwing a seventh on there. And you might get a little more color out of your chords, a little more expression, a little more fun with them. So try that out. That's it for this lesson. We will check you in the next lesson, the last one, I think. See you there.